Welcome to Moments with Marianne. I'm so delighted we're spending this time here today. We have a very empowering show coming right up with special guest Kate-Kaufmann, and she's here today to share with us her new book, Do You Have Kids? Life When the Answer is No. Now, Kate embarked on her life as a non-mom when she abandoned fertility treatments, quit her corporate job, and moved from the suburbs to a rural community to raise sheep. Since 2012, she has talked with hundreds of women ranging in age from 24 to 91 and advocates for better understanding in the childless, child-free demographics. Kate received her MFA in creative writing in 2016 from the Northwest Institute of Literary Arts and has a professional background in corporate staffing, training, and consulting. So let's welcome to the show, Kate-Kaufmann.
Thank you, Marianne. Pleased to be here.
What an honor it is to have you here and to talk about your new book. I mean, as an author, you have to be very proud. I hear it's getting some really great reviews.
I am, and it's only a few weeks old, so it's still a fledgling finding its feet.
Well, hey, congratulations. And, I have to ask you, what inspired you to write this book?
Well, I think like many, many people, I was inspired to write this book because it was the book I needed to read. And after my then husband and I stopped trying to have kids, we went through some fertility treatments. We moved to a rural area in Western Oregon, and there was everyone had kids in the country. And so I went looking for the kinds of information and stories and guidance that I think young mothers get from mothers who go before them, and I couldn't find them. And so I went on this quest for who are those wayfinders and guides that can lead women like me who don't have kids, women and men like me who don't have kids, as to what their futures might involve.
Well, it's interesting because we do have we have generations of people who can't have children, and then groups of people who also are choosing not to have children.
Yes.
And so sometimes it can be this awkward discussion that happens where people are like, oh, so do you have kids? How many do you have? And, it's kind of like the discussion ends when the answer is no.
You're absolutely right. And it's the odds that people are going to say yes, because 80 to 85% of us will go on to become parents. And that's partially why we named the book as we did, because when that answer is no, there's an opportunity to decide, as the person who doesn't have kids, what you want to do with that opportunity to guide the conversation in a direction that fits where you are in that moment, whether it be excusing yourself, saying, no, I don't, and excuse me, I need to go talk to that other person or refresh my snacks. Or to actually try to engage in the topic with the other person.
So what are some of the stories that you share for our listeners that are, of women that have shared with you their journey in regards to not having children?
Oh man, I have had the distinct pleasure of talking with women from their 20s up into their 90s about how not having kids has impacted their lives. And as a result of having those conversations, whether in small groups or in one-on-one conversations with them, what I found is that each and every one of us is impacted in some way by not having kids all throughout our lives. And so you mentioned that sometimes you wanted kids and it didn't happen, and other times you chose not to have children. And that's a feature, I think, most strongly in the earlier years. And as time goes by, we tend to move towards the middle, and we look at things like how our work is impacted, how our friendships morph and change over the course of our lifetimes. I talked with one woman, she lives in Connecticut, who her best friend, as she had children, made a conscious decision to make room in her life for her friends who did not have kids as a way of demonstrating her own self-care and creating balance in her life. All the way through to some of the older women that I spoke with talked about how they created meaning and purpose and their own forms of legacy without leaving behind the footsteps of their own children.
Mm-hmm. I think it's such a powerful discussion to have because I totally understand as someone who doesn't have children, friends of mine who over the years who have, developed a family, you know, and, in many ways they don't really take that time to themselves to stay connected with their female friends. And so you get this kind of interesting change that happens. And, I'm sure a lot of it's pretty natural. And at the same time, it has people who don't have children kind of questioning, going, okay, so where does that put us or me? Or, it's almost like you're the third wheel at a party all the time.
Yes, and that's so interesting because we tend to cut ourselves into ever smaller pieces, particularly as women. And yet what I find so very powerful is all along the way, we have interdependencies. And if we can morph and shift and take advantage of those friendships with people who are different than us, on our side with women who have kids, to learn different ways of looking at mothering and where we fit into the larger picture, as well as from the mother's point of view and father's point of view, to say, where are those interdependent points? For example, you and I know for sure that our kids are not going to step up to take care of us when we're in our latter years. And so we purposefully plan for it and have to think about, who do we ask to take on some of these responsibilities? And yet parents know that sometimes their children are not going to be well suited to certain roles, or for circumstances like distance may not be able to step up to take care of their roles. And so working together, we can move back and forth between the two worlds that certainly overlap but have different focuses.
Mm-hmm. I like that. Well, there's a portion in your book you talk about borrowing children, and I'd love for you to expand on that for our listeners.
Oh, that was it. When it came to me that every child, that when you don't have kids of your own, and I'm putting rabbit ears in the air because this concept of owning children is an interesting one. We borrow all of the children that we interact with, and the relationships that we have often are directly with those children themselves, separate and apart from the parents. I had an occasion a few days ago to reconnect with a young man who was in a play that I was in probably 15 years ago. Together we were in a play. And he shared with me how I filled a role in his life that was very distinct from that which his mother filled. And that over the years, he has reflected on some of the conversations and interactions that we've had that give his life some difference when he's looking at the various people who have had influence on him.
Mm. Well, it's really interesting because you look at this, with women, men, people who do not have children, but they want to be engaged with children. What a great, perspective to have,
Mm-hmm.
because you can lend a smile, encouraging word, so many things that really empower children along our journey without, we can borrow them, as you put it. So.
Yes, and sometimes it's more transactional in nature, and sometimes it's more long-term relationship based. And I think some of the relationship part of it comes as a result of the kind of relationship that the children have with their folks.
Mm-hmm. So do you find that women who, and just couples that maybe don't have children or have chosen not to have children, do they end up feeling like they're guilty or feel like they're selfish for not having kids, or are they perceived that way?
I think the latter is more true. The perceptions and the enculturation, because we are a pronatal culture, and there is a cultural expectation that's reinforced in the media that we go on to create our biological families. That being said, I think there's also a little bit of a mystery of what are these people doing who only represent 15 to 20% of the population. What are they doing with their lives, and how do they find their meaning and purpose? And because I think we tend to go quiet during the periods of infertility, decision making, finding out through our circumstantial situations that we won't have children, we get quiet about it. And then there needs to be something that happens that brings us back into communicating and participating in a more fully present way, including the fact that we don't have children.
What's some of the dialogue that people who don't have children can use when they're asked these questions like, oh, do you have kids? Why don't you? Is there some, appropriate dialogue, or is it how we, when we first start our discussion, more of excusing ourselves and kind of moving to, to another area?
Oh, absolutely. And I think that the excusing ourselves part would be, say, for example, when I was in the early stages of going through fertility treatments, that question was so challenging. We think it's a very innocent question, like a question about the weather. But sometimes there are stories behind the question and the answer to the question that make it difficult to answer. And so I feel very strongly that when you're responding to the question and the answer is no, the first thing that you want to do is really check in with, where are you emotionally? Where are you in the relationship with the person who's asking the question? And how do you feel in the moment responding? Now, that being said, we have the advantage of knowing that the answer to the question is no, and making some choices in advance about developing different responses to fit different circumstances. And so, for example, when I get the question now, it's a wonderful question, and I have had the privilege of participating in some remarkable conversations. And I'll take it some way like, do you have kids? And I say, no. And I'm wondering, do you have other people that you know in your life who don't have kids?
Mm.
How has your relationship developed with them over time? How do you find share interests?
Those are good questions.
And we all know people who don't have kids. When I moved to the country, I thought I didn't know anyone who didn't have kids. But when I started purposefully looking, it's like, oh yeah, look at that person. Oh, I can talk to that person. Mm-hmm. And people reveal we're just a little more understated.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. One of my comebacks when people ask me is like, no, but I'm auntie to many, which is really true, so the borrowing of the children really does come into play.
Yes. And through the women that I spoke with, and men, I never found anyone who hated children. I found a number of people who were uncomfortable around children. But the other thing that was 100%, no one had any ill will towards someone for their having had children. There's across the board respect and care for the role of being a parent.
Mm-hmm. Well, and because, when you look at it, it's such a great responsibility, yes. and I think when, people who don't have children really realize just the enormity of that.
Yes. And the huge investment in time and resources. The USDA estimates, for example, that it costs a parent on average nearly $250,000 to raise a child from birth to age 17/18 through high school. And then college is extra on top of that. And so from the standpoint of life, investment in life energy, and that doesn't even count the time part of it, that says to me that those of us who don't have kids have some choice points and some choice points to perhaps choose less high-paying jobs, or jobs that have more risk involved, or that involve great amounts of travel. And then what plays out over the course of the lifetime is that one of the best predictors of someone having a charitable component to their estate planning is whether or not they have children. And it's much more likely that those without kids will have that element to their plans.
Mm-hmm. So what are some of the main differences that you see that women, choose or don't have children or don't become mothers?
Differences in terms of?
Just the different reasons.
Oh, the different reasons. Oh my goodness. It can range from finding out relatively early on. I spoke with one woman who knew as early as age 14 that she was physically not going to be able to have children. And then I spoke with her when she was in her 30s, and she had chosen that she did not want to have children on her own. And you can see that she could answer the question, why don't you have kids, in two different ways. I can't. Or she could say, I chose not to. And so there's much more nuanced responses to the question. So take it from physically the inability to not finding a partner and choosing not to go it on one's own, through having, I think the most common reason that people don't have children is that we can kick the decision-making can down the road until the time as women, barring any use of reproductive interventions, we're going to age out, and that will make the decision for us. And even if we avail ourselves of, for example, banking some of our eggs for future fertilization and use, that doesn't have as high of a success rate as sometimes we're led to believe. And then taking it all the way on to, I'm dedicating myself to advanced education and challenging careers, to not connecting with the person that you want to have kids with, all the way through to recognizing that perhaps there are some environmental or genetic conditions in one's family that you have a risk of passing on. I know I interviewed another woman who had a manic depression, and she knew if she would have to go off her meds in order to have a child, and that would come at great personal risk, not only to her, but that she risked passing on what had been a hugely challenging condition to her future children. All the way through to, I'm just not suited to be a mom. I have many other ways I'm giving to the world, and this is how I'm going to spend my life energy. And I live in a time when I have that opportunity. And I guess taking it through, we still don't know what the impact of the Great Recession will have on the birth rates there. Of course, the economics that I mentioned earlier, and some of the environmental concerns that are shared by a number of people in making the choice against having kids.
Yeah. Well, when you look at some of the differences, some of the reasons, and then you look at the financial, impact it has as well, it's very easy to understand why so many people are deciding, maybe that's not the road I want to go down.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And then the question becomes, and so what else am I going to do with my life? And that's really where my interest came in writing the book and in being entrusted with these stories to steward about the different ways people have traveled the full life cycle to really put together families of the heart, to live in community in perhaps different ways, to look at time in a little different fashion, and carrying it all the way through as a way to project what might be in store and what are the various different paths that one might choose in composing a fully realized life.
Along your journey and as you've written this book, what is a story that's really stuck out for you?
Oh gosh,
There are many, right?
there are so many. I have to say, just personally, being entrusted with these stories has been so hugely impactful on my own life. I think I started out feeling fairly accepting of my own integration of my reality into my life. Now, having talked with so many people, it has been eye-opening and heart-warming to me. I think of I mentioned the 91-year-old. I think of her looking back at her own life and thinking about how she wants to make a mark. She happened to, with her husband very early on, buy a little piece of land on an island, and they built a little platform to camp on over the years. And then he died in his early 40s, and she continued with the land, built a small place on the land. And as she was looking at her legacy, she realized that she held the last piece of property, with one exception, that would create a ringed reserve, land reserve, that could be retained for future generations. And so she worked to raise the funds to help buy the remaining piece of property. And then she put her piece of property into a conservation easement that, in fact, created that last link around this beautiful piece of land in this little cove that will be that way forever now.
What a beautiful story. And to hear, just looking back and looking at the legacy that she's choosing to leave behind. I mean, how empowering is that?
Yes, and so people will come in the future to that land and they may know her story, but more likely they won't. And then you can take the less personally tagged stories, and the stories of women who've dedicated themselves, many of whom that I spoke with are teachers, whether they be at the college level or at the elementary school level. And particularly at the earlier grade level, realizing that teaching the phonics sounds, for example, would last with that child forever, but that child would never attribute it directly to that particular teacher, was a source of true life value and contribution in a way that did not have a name attached to it.
Yeah, that's very impactful. You look at that, and you're right. I look back and it's like, wow, I can't really remember my teacher that taught that, but just the impact it's made on a child's life. You just multiply that. My goodness.
Yes, and if we look at mothering as a verb, there are all different ways to mother animals, to mother our communities, to mother our relationships. I mentioned the older woman. There's a young woman. The older woman has had a long career in art jewelry making. And a younger woman just recently launched a retrospective of the older woman's work. Both women don't have children. And the younger woman curated this exhibit that had a beautifully attended opening in San Francisco, attended by the woman who is now 95.
Oh, wow. That must have been amazing.
Yes,
to be part of all that.
Yes, we celebrate in all different ways.
Well, and isn't that the truth? Because I know a lot of times when people don't have children, it can be like, and we talked about this in the beginning, a little uncomfortable in many settings. I mean, you look also in a religious standpoint, sometimes people feel uncomfortable being in their congregation or church with not having any children.
I'm glad you brought that up. And as we come on to Mother's Day, I know there'll be many congregations that will hand out flowers to the mothers. And that's one of those instances with just the slightest little shift, to be able to turn it to the verb that will allow a more inclusive approach.
Yeah, I would agree with that 100%. I've had a dear friend. She, went through fertility, tried to get pregnant, had several miscarriages. And Mother's Day at her church would be very difficult because they would do that thing. They'd hand out flowers and she'd burst into tears.
Yes.
It was heartbreaking.
Yes. And I think they're going back to that idea that we choose our timing and what we do. If those of us who don't have children notice that and make the connection, whether we chose not to have children or we shared in the desire for children that didn't come to fruition, that reaching out is how we can create that same kind of awareness and and sharing of our truths with other people who are more similarly situated.
Yeah, isn't that the truth? Well, I understand that you intend to do a whole lot with this book. In fact, you are starting a conversation around all this. Why don't you share a little bit about that with us?
Oh, yes. The idea is we can think about this and we can read about this. When I finished writing the main portion of my book, I realized, oh, here we've shared all these stories. What do we want to have happen? Well, what people are going to want to do is to talk about it. And yet, as you pointed out, we don't know how to talk about the topic. And so I added a little how-to part about that puts words in, gives options of things to say to open up the conversation, whether you're the mother hearing the answer, no, what you can do then, or the woman who doesn't have children, or women talking to each other about not having kids. Because we have many things to compare and contrast and learn from each other. And all we need to do is have the courage to walk with open heart and full loving curiosity. And then we get to learn this whole other dimension of what it's like to be in the world under different circumstances. And it's not like every parent is thrilled and happy with the way that their family life has unfolded. And to be able to have a more fully realized meeting between those with whom we can talk makes huge changes. I have 3 younger sisters, all of whom have kids. And as a result of doing this book, we've had completely different levels of conversation than we've ever had before.
Oh, wow. That really they're probably looking at the discussion in a light that they've probably never seen it in before.
Exactly. I had one of the people who is in the book, their husband who has children, so the new blended family. And he said, my goodness, there are all these people that we've lived with, but we know so little about. And so he now is approaching it with more curiosity than with the idea of any kind of judgment, but more discovery.
Well, I feel that this is a great book, not only to start the discussion, but for people to really educate themselves in regards to different points of view, because not everyone is living the same way, doing the same thing. Kate, where can our listeners connect with you and learn more about you and your work?
I have a website, kate-kaufmann, KAUFMANN.com. And it includes various ways to link with me, whether through sending messages, or it also has my schedule of different appearances throughout the country. And I'm active on social media, and I welcome connections and through conversations like this, Marianne.
Well, and before we get going here, I know you had an event tomorrow at Powell's City of Books in Portland, Oregon. So if you're in the Oregon area, you want to make sure to drop by and not only join Kate for her book signing, but be there for that event. That's at 7:30 p.m. Kate, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show with us here today.
I appreciate it very much.
Well, thank you, Kate. It's been such an honor to spend this time with you. And of course, to talk about your new book, Do You Have Kids? Life When the Answer is No. Again, you can connect with Kate Kaufmann at kate-kaufmann.com. And her book's available at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and all indie retailers. Well, that's the end of our time today. I would like to thank everyone for tuning in. You're listening to Moments with Marianne. And remember, make every moment count.
In a single moment, your life can change. Moments with Marianne is a transformative hour that covers an endless array of topics with the best of the best. Her guests are leaders in their fields, ranging from inspirational authors, top industry leaders, and business and spiritual entrepreneurs. Each guest is gifted and a true visionary. A recognized leader in her own work, and while teaching others to develop, refocus, and grow, Marianne will bring the best guest and sometimes a special surprise. Don't miss this. You never know just which moment will change your life forever. Moments with Marianne airs every Sunday, Monday, Thursday, and Friday at 8 p.m. Eastern and 5 p.m. Pacific Time. Make sure to tune in and visit momentswithmarianne.com for more information.